Ethan Rivers had always believed that hard work and dedication could build the perfect life, and for the first few years of his marriage to Grace, it seemed like he was right. They were a power couple in the bustling suburbs of Seattle. Ethan, a software engineer with a rising career, and Grace, a marketing director at a prestigious firm, were the envy of their friends. They had it all: an upscale home, a beautiful daughter, Jessie, and a lifestyle that seemed straight out of a magazine. But perfection is a fragile thing. Ethan had always thought that as long as they worked together, nothing could break them apart. Grace had always been the ambitious one, the one who wanted to climb the corporate ladder with a fierce determination. Ethan admired that about her, even when her late nights at work became more frequent. He believed it was just the price of success, something they both had to pay for their dreams. The long hours, the overtime, the business trips, he thought they were all just part of the journey. But slowly, without even realizing it, their world was starting to crumble. At first, it was the little things. Grace would disappear into her office, eyes glued to her laptop, barely acknowledging him when he came home after a long day of coding. Ethan had grown used to the silence, but it still bothered him. His wife, once the person who made him feel like he was the most important man in the world, was becoming a stranger. Then there were the texts. Short, cryptic messages she'd quickly swipe away when he came into the room. At first, Ethan brushed it off as work-related. But there were nights when he would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if it was all really just work. He tried to dismiss the nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach, but it was getting harder to ignore. One evening, after putting Jessie to bed, Ethan walked into the living room to find Grace sitting on the couch, staring at her phone with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. There was something different about the way she looked at the screen, something unfamiliar in her expression. The smile faded when she saw Ethan standing in the doorway. "Is everything okay?" Ethan asked, trying to sound casual, though his heart was racing. Grace put the phone down a little too quickly. "Of course, just busy with work, you know how it is," she replied, her voice a little too calm, too rehearsed. Ethan nodded, but the unease didn't leave him. There was something she wasn't telling him, something she was hiding. He had learned to trust his instincts, and they were screaming at him now. The next few days felt like they were wrapped in a thick fog. Every time Ethan looked at Grace, he felt as though he was seeing a stranger, someone he didn't know. The affection had faded. The easy conversations, the shared laughter, they were gone, and in their place was an uncomfortable silence that lingered between them, suffocating any attempt at normalcy. But it wasn't just Grace's distance that bothered him. It was the change in him, too. He had become withdrawn, consumed with thoughts of what was happening to their marriage. The tension was palpable, but neither of them seemed willing to address it. And the worst part? Ethan wasn't sure if he even knew how to fix it anymore. He wanted to confront her. He wanted to demand the truth, but the fear of what he might find held him back. What if his suspicions were true? What if his wife, the woman he had built his life with, was drifting away from him, emotionally, and maybe even physically? Late one night, after a long day at work, Ethan returned home to an empty house. Grace had gone out again, telling him she had a late meeting. It wasn't unusual. She'd been coming home later and later these days. But this time, when he sat in the living room, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He felt like a ghost in his own life, hovering on the outside of a reality he no longer understood. He picked up his phone and checked the time. It was well past midnight. The unsettling silence in the house pressed down on him, and for the first time, Ethan asked himself, "What if I'm not enough for her anymore?" His thoughts were interrupted when he heard the sound of the front door opening. Grace walked in, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor. She was late, again, but something was different tonight. There was a coldness in her eyes, a sharpness to her movements. She didn't greet him, didn't even acknowledge his presence. She just walked past him, heading straight for the stairs. Ethan opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. The years of love, trust, and shared dreams felt like they were slipping through his fingers. "Grace," he started, his voice hoarse, "we need to talk." She paused at the bottom of the stairs but didn't turn around. "I'm too tired for this right now, Ethan. I'll talk to you tomorrow." And with that, she disappeared upstairs. Ethan stood frozen in the living room, the weight of the silence crushing him. Tomorrow. But how many tomorrows had they already wasted? How many times had he told himself that they would fix things, that things would go back to normal? He didn't know how much longer he could keep pretending that everything was fine. The illusion of perfection was falling apart piece by piece, and Ethan had no idea what was waiting on the other side. The silence in their home had become deafening. Ethan's suspicions grew louder each day, gnawing at him until he could no longer ignore them. Grace's demeanor had changed. Her smile no longer reached her eyes, and the warmth that once radiated from her had been replaced by an icy distance. Ethan had tried everything, reaching out, suggesting they spend time together, take a vacation, or even just have dinner without distractions. But each time Grace's response was cold, dismissive. She was always too busy. One evening, after putting Jessie to bed, Ethan stood by the kitchen counter staring down at the unopened letter from the bank. The numbers inside told him that their savings were rapidly disappearing, but the real weight in his chest came from the fear of something even darker. Ethan couldn't take it anymore. His gut was screaming at him, and he had to confront her. "Grace," he said, his voice trembling but firm, "I need to know the truth. Something's wrong. We can't keep pretending everything is fine when it's clearly not." Grace didn't respond right away. She stood by the sink, her back to him. Ethan could hear her shallow breath as if she were preparing herself for something. When she turned around, her eyes were empty, devoid of the love he had known, the love that had once made him feel invincible. His stomach twisted with dread. "I know what you've been doing," Ethan continued, stepping closer to her. "I've seen the messages. I've seen the signs. Who is he, Grace?" She didn't look surprised. Her lips curled into something that was almost a smile, but there was no joy in it, only resignation. Her shoulders sagged, as if the weight of holding this secret for so long had finally become unbearable. "Ethan," she began, her voice almost a whisper, "I didn't want to hurt you, but I couldn't keep living a lie. Yes, I've been seeing someone. His name is Chad Armstrong. He's been working at the firm with me for over a year now." Ethan's heart dropped to his stomach. Chad. A name that had been floating around their house for months. Business dinners, late-night calls. The way Grace would go quiet every time Ethan asked about him. "You're cheating on me," Ethan said, the words feeling foreign in his mouth, as though the reality of them couldn't quite reach his brain. He tried to steady himself, but his hands were shaking. "How long has this been going on?" Grace's eyes flickered with something akin to guilt, but there was no apology, no remorse. "A few months," she admitted softly. "I didn't plan for it to happen, Ethan. It just happened, and now I don't know how to stop it." Ethan felt his chest tighten, as if he were suffocating under the weight of her words. The anger, the betrayal, the confusion, they all mixed together, a volatile cocktail that made it hard to breathe. But then, as if the emotional avalanche wasn't enough, Grace dropped a bombshell that would change everything. "I never wanted it to get this far, but now it's too late," she said, her voice colder than before. "I've made some choices that have put both of us in a position where you can't walk away from this. You don't have the power to leave me, Ethan. Not anymore." Ethan recoiled. "What do you mean? What the hell are you talking about?" Grace stepped closer, her eyes piercing through him with a cold intensity. "I've made sure that you can't. I've been using my position at work to make sure you stay dependent on me. Your job, your future, all of it is in my hands now. I'm in control, Ethan." Ethan's mind raced. Was this really happening? His wife, the woman he had loved and trusted for years, was not only betraying him but was now threatening his very livelihood. And then it hit him. This wasn't just about infidelity. It was about power, control, and manipulation. "Grace," Ethan's voice cracked as he struggled to find the words. You're telling me that you've been using me this whole time?" She nodded, her expression cold and unwavering. "You were always the one with the career to fall back on, the one with the freedom. But now I hold the strings. If you try to leave, if you try to take Jesse or challenge me in any way, I'll ruin you. I'll destroy everything you've worked for." The words hung in the air, thick with venom. Ethan felt his world shatter piece by piece. The love he had for Grace was still there, but it was buried under layers of deceit, manipulation, and betrayal. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. His thoughts raced, but amidst the shock and rage there was a flicker of clarity. He wasn't going to let this woman, this stranger in his life, control him any longer. "Is this how you want things to end?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. "With me on my knees at your mercy?" Grace's lips twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. "I'm not asking for your mercy, Ethan. I'm telling you that this is how it is now. The sooner you accept it, the easier it will be for you." And just like that, the man who had once believed in the strength of his marriage, in the love they had shared, was now facing an unimaginable reality. His world had been torn apart by the one person he trusted most. But Ethan wasn't going to let Grace's manipulations define him. He would fight back. He would find a way out even if it meant going to war. The weight of Grace's confession hung in the air like a suffocating fog. Ethan had always prided himself on his ability to stay calm under pressure. But in that moment he felt his world unraveling. His heart was pounding in his chest and his thoughts swirled in a haze. He had suspected it, but hearing her admit it out loud, he didn't know what to feel. Betrayal, anger, fear, but most of all a deep, bone-chilling sadness. Grace's words had left a mark that would never fade. She had been having an affair. Ethan had no idea how long it had been going on or who the man was, but that didn't matter yet. What mattered now was how to deal with the devastation that was crashing down on him. "Why?" The word came out barely as a whisper. Ethan was shocked at how raw and vulnerable it sounded. He had expected a fight, an argument, maybe even a denial. Instead, there was nothing but the brutal truth. Grace didn't meet his gaze. "I don't know how it happened, Ethan. It wasn't supposed to be this way. But somewhere along the line, I lost myself. I lost us. And now I can't fix it." Ethan stood there staring at her, his mind racing. The woman he had spent his life building a future with had slipped away from him without a second thought. How had he missed it? How had she become a stranger in their home? But something inside Ethan began to shift. The hurt and confusion were there, yes, but beneath it was a surge of determination. He was done being passive. Grace might have betrayed him, but he wasn't going to let her get away with it, not without answers. The next few days felt like a blur. Ethan couldn't focus at work. He couldn't sleep. But more importantly, he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that there was more to this story. Grace's affair wasn't just a result of her dissatisfaction with their marriage. No, there was something else, something deeper, something darker. Ethan knew he had to find out the truth, and he wasn't going to do it by sitting idly by. The thought of confronting her again, asking the same questions, felt useless. He needed concrete proof. He needed to uncover what Grace had been hiding, and he was willing to go to any length to get it. So he began his investigation. He started small. At first it was the little things, checking her phone when she was in the shower, going through her emails when she was out of the house. It felt like a violation of trust, but after what she had done to him, he couldn't bring himself to care. Ethan spent hours going through her texts, her emails, and her social media accounts, piecing together fragments of information like a detective on a mission. He found nothing immediately alarming, just small breadcrumbs, a late-night meeting here, a text there. But he knew there was more. The breakthrough came when he checked the credit card statements. Grace had been making frequent trips to a boutique hotel downtown, always on days when she claimed to be working late or out with friends. Ethan's blood ran cold. He had never suspected Grace of lying about something as trivial as her whereabouts, but now he could see the web of deceit she had woven. He made a mental note of the hotel's name and began researching. There were no glaring signs of scandal, no public reviews mentioning anything out of the ordinary, but the fact that Grace had spent so much time there, that she had kept it hidden from him. This was where the real investigation began. The more Ethan dug, the more questions arose. Who was she meeting? Was this a one-time mistake, or had it been going on for months? The answers weren't easy to find, but he was determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. As the days passed, Ethan grew more meticulous in his investigation. He followed Grace one afternoon, pretending to go for a walk with Jessie while she drove off in the car. He kept a safe distance, not wanting to raise suspicion, but when he saw her pull into the parking garage of a high-rise apartment building, his heart skipped a beat. Was this where the man she had been seeing lived? Or was there something else going on? Ethan couldn't be sure, but the idea that Grace was involved in something far more serious than he had initially imagined filled him with a mixture of dread and anticipation. With every new piece of information he uncovered, the more determined he became. The truth was out there. He just had to find it. Ethan had never imagined that a marriage, a life he had painstakingly built over years, would come to this. What had started as a slow simmer of doubt had now erupted into a full-blown war. The walls that once stood as a symbol of their shared life together now felt like fortresses, each one erected to shield their respective secrets, lies, and ambitions. Grace had made her choice. Ethan's betrayal was raw, but now it was his turn to wrestle control of his own future. He wasn't just fighting for his marriage anymore. He was fighting for his dignity, his self-respect, and his ability to maintain control over a life that was swiftly slipping through his fingers. It had only been a few days since Grace's confession, but the sting had already transformed into something much more dangerous, the desire for retribution. He had taken the first steps toward reclaiming his life, but even as the bitterness of betrayal gnawed at him, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he was being watched. Grace had kept her distance, though her presence still loomed over him, especially now that her affair had come to light. Ethan couldn't help but wonder if she was playing a game he hadn't yet figured out. But he had an advantage, one that would allow him to fight back. As a coder, Ethan was used to solving complex puzzles, breaking down systems to expose flaws, and he would do the same now. He would uncover the truth about the affair, who was involved, how deep it went, and how to use the power of that information to put him back in the driver's seat. The first step was clear. He needed evidence. Ethan had always been methodical, relying on logic to guide him through problems. He was not a man of impulsive actions, and certainly not one to lash out. But his mind now raced with strategies, each more calculated than the last. He started by searching through Grace's things, trying to piece together any clues she might have left behind. A part of him felt guilty, but another part knew this was the only way to regain control. He needed something concrete, something undeniable. The first discovery came as a shock. Ethan found a series of receipts from a hotel not far from their home. Grace had booked the room multiple times over the last year, always on dates when she had told him she was working late or attending business dinners. His chest tightened as he stared at the receipts. His gut had been right. This was it, the proof that would finally give him the leverage he needed. He wasn't just being paranoid. He wasn't just imagining things. With each new clue, Ethan felt his anger grow stronger. His thoughts turned dark, consumed by the need to confront both Grace and the man who had stolen what should have been his. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about regaining the power he had lost. This was a fight for his life, his future, and his self-respect. But the evidence alone wasn't enough. Ethan needed to play his cards carefully. He wasn't some emotional wreck who would make rash decisions. He knew how to take his time, how to outmaneuver Grace's calculated behavior. This wouldn't be a battle of passion. It would be a battle of intellect and control. As the days wore on, Ethan began gathering information about the hotel, tracking down the employees who worked there, even finding the name of the man who had signed in under Grace's name. The more he uncovered, the more the picture became clear. He wasn't just fighting for his marriage anymore. This was about dismantling the life Grace had so carefully built. She had used her power, her connections, and her wealth to control him, to manipulate the situation to her advantage. It was time for Ethan to flip the script. He had become a man on a mission. Every piece of evidence he gathered felt like a small victory. But his ultimate goal was more than just exposing Grace's infidelity. It was about showing her, showing both of them, that he was no longer the passive husband he once was. He had power, he had control, and now he was going to use it to get his life back. The confrontation would come soon. He could feel it in his bones. But it would be a calculated one, a fight for the upper hand, not just a moment of angry release. Grace wouldn't expect it. She thought she had won, thought she could control everything. But Ethan had learned. He had learned how to fight with intelligence, not emotion. As he stood at the door to their bedroom, clutching the folder full of evidence, a sense of cold determination washed over him. He was ready. Grace had made her move, but now it was his turn. The battle for power had begun. Ethan's mind was clear and focused, cutting through the fog of confusion like a knife. He wasn't just hurt anymore. He wasn't even angry, not in the way he had been when he first learned about Grace's betrayal. Now there was only a sharp, cold resolve. He was going to uncover the truth, and he would do it his way, methodically, carefully, and with a precision that came naturally to him. His world had been shattered, but that didn't mean he had to stay broken. The plan had started forming the moment Grace had confessed. He had left their home in a daze, but the drive back to his apartment gave him time to think. He needed more than just words. He needed evidence, hard, undeniable proof. Only then could he confront her, and only then could he decide his next move. Ethan had always been a problem solver, whether in his career or his personal life. His mind was wired to analyze and break down complex systems. Now the system was his own marriage, and to find the truth, he would treat it like one of his coding projects, deconstruct it piece by piece until it gave up its secrets. He started with Grace's phone, the device that had been her window to the outside world, the secretive world where she had been living another life. Ethan hesitated for a moment, but only for a moment. He wasn't doing this out of malice. He was doing this to understand, to gain control. The betrayal had shattered his sense of trust, but he needed to know exactly what he was dealing with. After all, Grace had left him with no choice. She had drawn first blood, and now he would be forced to play the game. He didn't care that it felt like an invasion of privacy. What mattered was finding the truth. Ethan had always respected boundaries. He'd believed in trust as the cornerstone of any relationship, but trust had been violated. He had no illusions anymore. If he wanted to survive this emotional battlefield, he needed to fight back, and that meant digging deeper than he'd ever wanted to. He waited until the evening, when Grace would typically be out of the house for her late-night work meetings. Ethan knew her routine well. It wasn't that he had been obsessive about it in the past. He just knew her, their schedules, their lives together, as any husband would. But tonight, it was different. Tonight, he had a purpose. He slipped into their bedroom where Grace had left her phone charging on the nightstand. Ethan picked it up, his heart pounding in his chest. It felt like a violation, but he told himself it wasn't. This wasn't about revenge. This was about understanding. He unlocked the phone without trouble. She had never been one to complicate things with passwords. The first thing that struck him was the sheer number of messages. Texts, emails, app chats. They were all there in plain sight. Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he scrolled through the messages. He was prepared to find something, but not to the extent that he did. The affair wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a web of lies, carefully spun over months. He found a thread of messages from a man named Jared, someone Ethan had never heard of. The conversation was flirtatious at first, casual until it escalated. There were pictures exchanged, intimate exchanges. Everything that had once been sacred between Ethan and Grace now felt like a cruel parody. Ethan's eyes burned as he read. He wasn't angry yet. He wasn't sure if he could even feel anger anymore. He was numb. But there was one thing he knew for certain. Grace hadn't just betrayed him emotionally. She had betrayed their life together, the very foundation they'd built. The more he read, the more disgusted he felt. He couldn't believe it, but he had to. It was right in front of him. The guilt, the shame, and the sorrow all collided within him, but so did something else. Clarity. He had the evidence. He had the ammunition he needed. But now came the harder part, the confrontation. But before that, Ethan knew he needed to be more careful. He couldn't rush into this. There was no telling what Grace would do when she found out what he had discovered. The next steps would be delicate, precise. This wasn't just about getting answers anymore. It was about power. Ethan had been passive in his relationship for so long, allowing Grace's ambition and drive to overshadow his own. But this was his turn. He wasn't going to sit idly by and let her walk all over him. He saved the information on a secure drive, ensuring there was no chance of it being erased. The evidence was now in his possession. But as he sat there holding the phone in his hands, a sense of finality washed over him. This was the moment. His next move would define everything. No matter how much it hurt, no matter how deep the wounds went, he wasn't going to let this go. For once, Ethan was in control. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he stood in front of the door. His hand hovered above the handle, trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of what was about to happen. The evidence was undeniable now. He had the proof. The last few days had been a whirlwind, filled with hours of poring over Grace's messages, emails, and phone records. It was all there, every lie, every secret, every moment of her betrayal. But none of that mattered now. The truth had already been laid bare. It was time to face her. He'd thought about this moment countless times. The rage, the sorrow, the desperate need to ask, why? But as he stood there staring at the door to their home, everything felt different. It wasn't about the anger anymore. It was about what came next. What was he supposed to do now? How could he fix this? Or could it even be fixed? Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open. The apartment was silent, but the weight of the atmosphere felt suffocating. Ethan's eyes immediately landed on Grace, who was sitting at the kitchen counter, her back turned to him. She didn't even look up at his entrance. The silence hung between them, thick with unspoken words. "Grace," he said, his voice steady but laced with a quiet intensity. "We need to talk." She didn't respond immediately. Ethan could hear the soft clink of a coffee mug as she set it down on the counter, then the creak of her chair as she slowly turned to face him. Her eyes, those eyes that had once been full of warmth and affection, now seemed distant, like she was already gone, even if she was physically still there. She sighed, the sound almost too soft to hear, but it was there. A sound of resignation, a sound that told Ethan she knew exactly what was coming. "I'm sorry," Grace said, her voice barely above a whisper. But it wasn't the apology he had been expecting. It wasn't one filled with remorse or sorrow or regret. It was almost as if she was apologizing for the inconvenience of it all, like she was apologizing for getting caught. Ethan's jaw tightened, and his hand gripped the edge of the counter as if it would help steady him. "Sorry?" he repeated, his voice hard. "Is that all you have to say? You've been lying to me for months, Grace. You've been cheating on me, and now you're just sorry?" She finally met his eyes, but there was no real contrition in her gaze. There was something else, something that Ethan couldn't quite place. It was a flicker of defiance, maybe even a hint of contempt. "I didn't want to hurt you, Ethan," she said softly, her words almost calculated, like she was trying to soothe him. "But it just happened. It wasn't supposed to. I never planned for it." Ethan's eyes narrowed. He had heard these excuses before. He had heard them in movies, in books, in the conversations of people who thought they could get away with their mistakes because they were just human. But there was no humanity in this. There was only betrayal. "Don't you dare try to make this sound like an accident!" Ethan spat, his voice rising slightly. "You knew exactly what you were doing. You weren't just confused, Grace. You made a choice over and over again, and I was the fool sitting here believing in this illusion we built. Our marriage, our life." Her face flushed, but she didn't look away. "I never meant to hurt you," she repeated, but Ethan could see the cracks in her facade now. The words didn't reach her eyes. They were empty. "And yet, here we are," he replied bitterly. "You've destroyed everything we had, and now you're sitting here acting like you didn't." Grace shifted, unease creeping into her posture. The words she had been rehearsing in her mind didn't seem to fit anymore. There was no way to justify her actions, no way to make it sound less selfish. Ethan had already uncovered her lies. He wasn't listening to any more explanations. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Ethan's mind raced. What was he supposed to do now? Could he ever trust her again? Could they rebuild what had been broken? But even as these thoughts circled in his mind, something deeper, more unsettling began to take hold. This wasn't just about their marriage anymore. It was about power. Who had it? who controlled it, and who was going to lose. "I've already made my decision, Grace," he said finally, his voice cold and measured. "This isn't just about forgiveness anymore. This is about the truth, about what's been hidden and what's still left to uncover." Grace's eyes flickered with alarm. The game had changed. She could see it now. Ethan was no longer the naive husband. He had become something else, someone who wasn't going to let her control the narrative any longer. "You think you can just walk away from this?" Grace asked, a touch of panic creeping into her voice. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." Ethan stared at her, feeling a cold fury rise within him. This wasn't just about the affair. This was about power, the power to control, to hide, to destroy. And Grace had underestimated him. "I'm not walking away," Ethan said, his voice low but unwavering. "I'm going to make sure everyone knows the truth." The silence that followed was thick with tension. Grace opened her mouth to speak, but Ethan silenced her with a sharp look. "I want the truth, Grace, all of it. And if you think you can stop me, you're wrong." The sound of the door slamming shut echoed in the empty hallway, but Ethan barely noticed it. He sat motionless at his desk, his fingers tapping restlessly on the edge of a pile of papers. Grace's confession had come like a storm, devastating in its suddenness. But now, after days of silence, it was time to act. The whirlwind of emotions was still raw, but Ethan knew one thing. He couldn't let her win. The weight of everything that had happened hit him like a wave. His marriage, his entire life, had been upended by the one person he trusted the most. Now, it wasn't just about righting a wrong. It was about fighting for his future, his dignity, and his son's future. Grace had tried to use her wealth, her power, and her connections to manipulate the situation, but Ethan wouldn't let that happen. There was no turning back. He needed a plan. Ethan had always been a logical person. Even in the midst of the pain, he couldn't afford to make impulsive decisions. The last few days had been a blur of emotions, but now he had to focus. He needed a strategy, a way to level the playing field. That's when he remembered something Grace had said, something that stuck with him. "You don't understand, Ethan. You'll never be able to fight this. I have everything, money, power, connections. You have nothing." Her words had been meant to intimidate him, but in reality they lit a fire inside him. He had his son. He had his integrity, and most importantly, he had the truth. No amount of money or influence could change that. But the legal system, that was a different battleground. Ethan had always been the type of person to solve problems himself, but this was bigger than him. He needed expert help. That's when he reached out to Laura, the best divorce attorney in the city. Laura was known for her ruthless efficiency and her ability to take down even the most powerful clients. She was exactly what he needed. The next morning, Ethan found himself sitting across from Laura in her sleek, modern office. Her polished demeanor gave nothing away, but Ethan could tell from the way she analyzed him that she understood the gravity of the situation. She wasted no time getting to the point. "Here's the plan, Ethan," Laura began, her voice calm yet firm. "We have leverage. I've reviewed everything, emails, phone records, financial documents. Grace's betrayal is clear and we can use it, but we have to be careful. The last thing you want is for this to turn into a public spectacle." Ethan nodded, his mind racing. "What are my options?" Laura leaned forward slightly, tapping her pen on the desk. "First, we need to go for full custody of your son. Grace may be powerful, but she's also deeply involved in this affair. That could hurt her in court. If we can prove she's been neglecting her responsibilities as a mother, the judge will be on your side." Ethan felt a surge of hope. The thought of getting full custody of their son made him feel like he could finally regain some control over his life. "But it won't be easy," Laura continued. "Grace has a lot of resources and she won't go down without a fight. We'll have to be strategic. We need to gather more evidence, testimonies, surveillance footage, anything that shows her actions and how they've impacted your family." Ethan felt a flicker of fear, but he pushed it aside. The fight wasn't just about him anymore. It was about his son, his family, and he was willing to do whatever it took. Laura handed him a stack of papers. "This is your starting point. We'll begin the process of filing for divorce and I'll initiate the custody proceedings." But I need your full cooperation. This is going to get ugly. Ethan glanced at the papers, feeling the weight of the decision settle on him. This was the moment he had to commit. There was no going back now. Do whatever it takes, Laura, he said, his voice steady. I'm not going to let her walk away with everything. Laura nodded. Good. I'll handle the legal side. You focus on keeping your head clear and taking care of your son. This is going to get messy, but we'll fight for what's right. As he left Laura's office, Ethan felt a strange sense of clarity. He knew that this battle was going to change everything. His life, his marriage, and his future were all on the line. But he couldn't afford to back down. Not now. Not after everything Grace had done. He had a plan, and he was going to see it through. The cold, clinical hum of the coffee shop was a stark contrast to the storm that was raging inside Ethan's mind. As he sat across from Laura, his attorney, he couldn't shake the unease in his stomach. This wasn't just about securing a good lawyer. This was about getting back everything that had been taken from him. His home, his son, his dignity. Laura was sharp, calculating, everything Ethan needed in this fight. But as they sifted through paperwork and strategized over the next steps, a voice echoed in Ethan's mind. Do you really want to go through with this? The question lingered, and he found himself pausing, unsure of how to answer. He had never imagined his life would turn out this way. But after Grace's betrayal, after her cold threats, there was no other choice. He needed to fight. Laura's voice broke through his thoughts, grounding him in reality. We need more than just your word, Ethan. We need solid evidence. You know what Grace's resources are like. She won't back down easily. Ethan nodded, acknowledging the truth. Grace wasn't just his wife. She was the daughter of one of the wealthiest businessmen in the city, a woman with connections in every corner of their world. Her father's influence spread across media, politics, and business. Ethan had known from the start that this wasn't going to be an easy battle, but Laura had already shown him a glimmer of hope. Laura wasn't just another attorney in a sea of legal professionals. She had history with Grace's family, one that had played out like a bad soap opera. Years ago, Laura had worked for Grace's father, and while that job had ended in scandalous circumstances, it had also given Laura insight into Grace's darker side. There was a part of Grace, a part the public never saw, that Laura knew all too well, and that was exactly what Ethan needed. I've been waiting for this moment, Laura said, a small smile on her face. Grace thought she could manipulate everything in her life, control everything and everyone, but she left a trail. And that's where we strike. Ethan felt a flicker of hope, though he didn't show it. He had never been the kind of person to rely on others, but in this fight, he was going to need allies. Maybe Laura could be the ally I didn't know I needed. Are you sure you're up for this? Ethan asked, his voice steady, but his words heavy with meaning. Laura's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of something dangerous passing through her gaze. You don't get to where I am without knowing how to handle power players like Grace. This isn't just a divorce, it's about a personal reckoning, and I'm not going to let her steamroll you. The weight of her words hit him. Laura had her own reasons for wanting to take down Grace, and Ethan's case was now personal for both of them. He realized then that he wasn't just fighting for his son anymore. He was fighting for something bigger, something that transcended money, power, and revenge. He was fighting for justice. I need you to get me everything you can on Grace, Ethan said, his voice firm. Every detail, every interaction. She won't be able to hide what she's done, not anymore. Laura leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping rhythmically on the table. We'll need to move fast. Grace is already preparing her own defense. But I've got the resources. If we're going to win, we'll need to strike before she even knows what hit her. Ethan felt a rush of adrenaline as he nodded. He wasn't just reacting to Grace's betrayal anymore. He was becoming the architect of his own future, and with Laura by his side, the fight had just begun. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension. Ethan stood at the back, watching as his lawyer, Laura, met with the opposing counsel, Grace's ruthless, high-powered attorney, Samantha Harris. The two women were dressed impeccably, their attire sending a silent message of authority and control. It was clear that this wasn't just a divorce case for them. This was a battle for power, a contest of wills. And Ethan was caught in the middle, fighting for everything he had left. He had no illusions about the difficulty of this case. Grace was powerful. her family's influence stretching far beyond what most people realized. Samantha Harris had a reputation for winning, no matter the cost. But Laura had her own strengths. She knew how to play the game, and she had been preparing for this moment for weeks. Every piece of evidence, every argument, every move was carefully calculated. Ethan could feel the weight of it all on his shoulders. This wasn't just about custody. This wasn't just about money. It was about his future, and his son's future. As the judge entered the room, everyone stood. The proceedings began with formalities, but Ethan's mind was elsewhere. He couldn't stop thinking about the last few weeks, the quiet moments when Grace's cold demeanor had been exposed for what it was. The way she had looked at him in that meeting with the lawyer, as if the love they had shared was a distant memory, easily erased by the power she had at her disposal. "Mr. Carter," the judge's voice broke through his thoughts. "Your opening statement?" Ethan's heart raced. He wasn't prepared to speak yet, but this was his moment. He had to say something, to fight for his son. He straightened his back and stepped forward, his hands trembling ever so slightly. "Your Honor, I never imagined I'd be standing here today," Ethan began, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "But I stand before you not just as a man fighting for his rights, but as a father who wants nothing more than to protect his child from a situation that has already done enough damage." He paused, glancing over at Grace, who sat across the room, flanked by her father's legal team. Her eyes were cold, devoid of any emotion, as if she were a stranger to him. The woman he had loved seemed to have evaporated, replaced by someone willing to do whatever it took to win. Ethan felt a surge of anger but pushed it down, channeling it into his words. "Over the years, I've seen the woman I married change. She became someone I didn't recognize, a person driven by ambition, by a need for control, and as I stand here today, I know that my son's well-being is at risk. I won't allow him to be manipulated by the very people who should be looking out for him." Ethan glanced back at Laura, who gave him a subtle nod of encouragement. He had made his first move. Now it was time to let Laura take the lead. "Your Honor?" Laura stood, her voice clear and commanding. "We will present evidence that clearly shows Mr. Carter's commitment to his family and his child. His love for his son is unquestionable, and his intentions have always been to give him the stability and care he deserves." Samantha Harris, sitting across the room, stood to respond. Her presence was intimidating, but Ethan could see the cracks in her armor. She had no emotional attachment to the case. She was here to win, and that was all. But this time, Ethan wasn't going to let her. He wasn't just fighting for a legal victory. He was fighting for what mattered most, his family. As the trial went on, the tension mounted. Each side presented its case, but the stakes kept rising. Grace's team painted Ethan as an unfit father, someone who had failed to provide for his family in the way they expected. They played on his history with the company, highlighting his past struggles and the challenges he had faced before his success. They tried to undermine his credibility, casting doubt on his ability to provide a stable home for his son. But Laura countered with precision, turning their accusations against them. She emphasized Ethan's transformation over the years, his dedication to improving himself for the sake of his family. She showed how he had taken full responsibility for his past mistakes and how his actions in the present proved that he was more than capable of being a good father. The courtroom was a battlefield with every word, every piece of evidence carrying weight. It wasn't just a contest of facts. It was a contest of emotions, of integrity, and of the truth. By the end of the day, Ethan was mentally exhausted, but he knew that this was just the beginning. The real fight had only just started. There would be more battles, more tests, and more moments where his resolve would be tested. But he was ready. He had to be. As the judge called a recess, Ethan left the courtroom with Laura by his side. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the case settle in. This wasn't just about money, custody, or control. This was about his life, his future, and the future of his son, and he wasn't going to lose.